All right, folks, let's talk about PS5's activity card system, which right now appears to be completely broken, or at the very least, this was intended. And this is Sony saying, okay, fundamentally, this is not what we thought it would end up being, and we're giving up. Which it's so funny that, I guess it kind of went by with not a lot of people noticing. Some certainly did. I saw it pop up on the PS5 subreddit. I know a few people were reaching out even before that, just saying, hey, I'm trying to use cards and they're not really working anymore, which it is kind of tied directly to that most recent beta and now 10.0 firmware that we have, where Sony did make a change to how cards appear on game hubs, which this is also, you would assume, separate from the problem we had recently where we had official game news take over the entire background image of a game if a game did have game news published down here, right? So it would pull up this image instead of the standard key art for that particular game. That's been fixed, addressed. It's all server-side because activity cards and game hubs and the way those pictures tend to update and change out, it's all server-side. You have to be connected online to actually use those features and have that stuff actually happen. You can still play games offline, obviously, but the point is, with the way activity cards do work, the big change they made during the beta and now 10.0, the final OFW that's out there, is that they got rid of the resume or start activity button next to the play game button, which I felt was a good decision because, quite frankly, it was sheer bloat. We've been covering activity cards ever since the console came out. I've been very carefully watching how they've made minor changes and adjustments and how they're trying to get people to use them more. And we've also looked at how developers use them, and it's incredibly inconsistent to the point where if studios are not using cards in such a manner where they're intending on, because the whole sales pitch initially with PlayStation 5 is you boot a game up from a card, it skips splash screens, it takes you right to that particular portion of the game, maybe a single player mission, maybe multiplayer matchmaking. The whole idea is you launch from a card and it takes you to that part of the game. But the reality was a lot of games simply did not do that. Now, the sort of gold standard for a lot of titles was PlayStation Studios, first party. They're the ones that will tend to have the best practices actually be used. So there's a few titles where they will do that, and it is very handy and great, but a lot of the third-party stuff, it's like incredibly inconsistent. But before we get into that whole pit of conversation, let's at least talk about this. They removed the button, which I think was a good decision, because again, it was kind of redundant. The card didn't leave though, right? So we've got Astro's Playroom, a very basic day one example. The card is still here, right? So it shows up, it's labeled a single player, continue where you left off, current activity, CPU Plaza. We can still bring it up, and fundamentally everything about cards is still there, and that you've got game help, we've got the little video right here that we can bring up. We can look at the estimated time because there's all these different factors and sort of permutations of how developers can support cards. And so like Astro's Playroom is a really good gold standard example here. But, even though the card didn't go anywhere, it is still live. It's taking over the game hub picture. We launch it this way, and it's going to be a cold start. It's like this for every single game. So I will just skip to the end right here, right now. You can see Astro's Playroom. We're up on the main menu. We can hit continue from here. I've spent all day pretty much testing this across 2 different consoles. I tried 3, but the problem with, basically the way I did this was I tried to have a control system. I've got one console that's on 9.0, but because this is all server side, the console is simply too old to where I can't test it offline. It's going to prompt me to install new firmware. But I've got one console that's still on the previous 10.0 beta firmware, the 3.0 variant of that firmware, and I'm still able to log into PSN, and I can still launch via cards and things like that, but it's the same behavior. So between OFW and the beta firmware, this seems to be where they did make this change, but again, it's server side, so in theory, they could possibly switch this back on. But, I tested a lot of the first party stuff that I know for a fact is supposed to skip all those splash screens, take you right to those in the moment, single player activities or perhaps multiplayer. So between Astro's Playroom, Spider-Man games, Sackboy Big Adventure, they're all supposed to skip the screens. They just simply don't do it anymore. Now, again, third party was like the problem, right? I mean, I did one video back in That was like 2022, I think. It was around when Forbidden West came out, and it was sort of a bigger deep dive analysis on like what's going on with third parties, and like that's where it's so problematic, right? I mean, like the one examples that we do have, I wish I could test more, but now I can't because this is the behavior that will happen no matter what when I'm connected online. But Ghost Runner didn't skip anything, doesn't matter if you use a card or not. Hades, same thing, does not skip cards, doesn't do any of that jazz. It just takes you to the menu. It's like nearly the same speed too. Then you've got Pumpkin Jack, where that didn't skip any splash screen logos, but it does take you right to the last level. So it like saves you a little bit of time, but really not that much. I know Grand Theft Auto 5 was like a weird thing where the card was straight up broken, as in if you tried to launch the game from a card and do single player or also I think multiplayer as well, but it would just hang and it would never load. It's actually a worse way to boot the game up essentially. Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War, using a card from the game hub would only take you to the main menu if you're, say, doing a cold start. You launch the game from the card, but if you're in game, then you use the card from the control center while you're again already playing the game, then it would take you to matchmaking. So it's like that was 2 years ago, right? And that's what was so annoying. So when they removed the button with the most recent firmware, it's like that's fine. Nothing of value was lost here because there's literally, for most titles, mind you, if most games are not really skipping splash screens and doing what cards are supposed to do, that means you've got two buttons right next to each other that do the same thing. They're cold starts. And so I was fine with that, right? But 2 years ago, I made the argument of what Sony should be doing is not necessarily mandating the use of cards, because that's going to be really problematic for a lot of studios, but it's a matter of, hey, we'd love you to use them. If you do, here's how then you mandate the behavior, right? You don't mandate the feature, you mandate the behavior. If you are going to use cards, awesome. Here's what they got to do. You have got to skip splash screens. You've got to take the player right to that moment in the game for what your card is serving. It's all in the context of the game, the scope of the game. I mean, some titles, there's a little bit of variance there. Demon's Souls is a game where you can't just freely fast travel around because you drop souls. So it's like that game can't do it. Forbidden West at the time, I remember this quite well because Forbidden West and the Horizon games, you can't freely fast travel in that game either. You have to craft the fast travel packs. So launching from a card would only, skip everything, but then it would just like add the map marker on the map for you. Like, okay, I guess that's like the compromise they would have to do in the context of that game. But I digress, folks. It's simply a matter of I feel like Sony basically just gave up, right? Because cards are not gone. They're still here. I've got it right here, CPU Plaza. But I have pretty much confirmed now at this point across a lot of titles that this stuff just doesn't work. It used to be something where even if you were in-game on, say, Astro's Playroom, I'd hit resume game, it does not do anything. It won't, none of these games will do anything anymore, but it's server-side. So in theory, this is where Sony could turn them back on, but I don't know if this really was sort of a we give up kind of thing. Oddly enough, let me show you this though. If we go to challenges, which not a lot of games use this, in light of Astrobot now getting that recent speedrun level, I assume it still works over there. I haven't actually started up that content just yet. But challenges work. This is the one thing that works. Because it is a separate activity card, and it will take you to the speedrun. It's the only circumstance I've seen so far that will work. But like so few games use the sort of challenge card. I think Astro is like one of the only games I know of. I'm sure other folks can probably chime in, but that one does work. Otherwise, though, everything else is completely broken. I've tried. I've tested a lot of games. It's a blanket on-off switch. Right now, it is off, which in a way is, I guess, disappointing, right? Because in practice, what activity cards were supposed to be made a lot of sense. And I feel like it would have probably caught on if just the behavior was the same across all these games. It's a matter of player behavior, obviously. Players have to, sort of see the value of what that feature is intending on offering. And then the company has this telemetry. I'm sure they see how often players are using, opening, and interacting with activity cards, but that wasn't working, and it certainly wasn't working with developers. You need developers to support the feature, right? So the fact that the mileage was just incredibly inconsistent, and then you've got players that can't rely on using them because the expected behavior is so different across all these different titles, that now we're to a point where we've got cards that will take over the background screen. It still will, they pop up, right? Occasionally you've got one here because I've just tested all these games. Yeah, Sackboy's not showing up. And sometimes they don't show up too. Again, it's online dependent as well. Obviously, these classic games won't display it or anything. But yeah, I'm just, I wonder if this is like a matter of the company saying, yep, we're just going to turn it off. Okay, so future Ryan here, chiming in from 2 days later after that last clip that you just saw. And that was actually where I was going to stop the video and upload it from there. But you can see it is 3 a.m. on a Wednesday, about 5 hours before I was planning on uploading this, and Sony decided to send out a brand new PS5 system software update version 10.20, where a singular changelog item on there does relate to activity cards, where it says activities now display as in progress, not started or completed, depending on whether you have ever started or completed the activity, and also potential spoilers will still be hidden. Now that doesn't really address the problem that we're looking at here, where activity cards are no longer skipping splash screens and logos and things like that, but that's still enough for me to fire consoles up again, have a controlled system, update one, do some back and forth testing, and just really validate and make sure that this is still not working, which the long and short of it is it's still not working, or rather maybe it's intentional. So I do want to mention first, as far as this update goes, they have indeed made some minor changes to, like, you know, the text box and how certain cards appear and how they're ordered. Very minor stuff in the grand scheme of things, more of a maybe a quality of life thing, but in terms of the sheer ordering and whatnot, that's what they've done here. But and you can still see, like, most of what we've been talking about with activity cards is still present as far as like the variables for what developers can do. Progress bars are still live, estimated time for completion, all the game help videos, all that stuff's still there. You just can't launch activities anymore and use them to skip to certain parts of a game if the developer has supported them, the entire conversation. So the one thing I want to add here, which is very important, perhaps this recent firmware is more evidence of this, but I think this actually maybe was intentional, because this firmware is more about the language surrounding activities. And the one thing I overlooked, even with this most recent conversation earlier in the video, is that the language itself for activities is different now, right? So with Sackboy, it's currently running. If I hit view activities, I can hit resume game, right? Not start activity, not resume activity, resume game. And then if I scroll down, well, for some reason the horizontal row is not showing me more activities, but a game that is not currently launched, again, we can see a card is baked right into the game hub, and that will say play game. These buttons used to say start or resume activity, not even so much when they were, you know, two buttons right on the front row of the game hub, but rather anytime you would evoke or bring up a card, look at a card, doesn't matter if the game was running or not, it would always say activity, resume, or start the activity. Now it always does refer to it simply as game, resume or play game. I think that language pretty much implies that they intentionally chose to sort of switch off the core mechanic of activities and how they skip across various parts of games, if the game was doing that, since most of them, quite frankly, don't. And also, Astro's Playroom still allows you to jump with the challenges, which are not appearing on the bottom row here. But I can launch this, and same thing, it says play game, it's a cold start. So that's the minor update. I'm now feeling a little bit more, I have more conviction in saying maybe this was an intentional thing. It's so easy to overlook too, right? Because most games don't really do it the way that Sony was intending that to be a thing. So with that said, I guess now we will end the conversation. This is very up to date because I filmed this like 5 hours before you're watching this go live on YouTube. But I think that's where cards stand right now. Most of the features are still there, but the dream of jumping to certain portions of a game in the interest of time doesn't really seem to be a thing anymore. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in my next video. You take it easy.